Why?
Visit us online at whyradioshow.org.
Is produced by the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, a division of the University of North Dakota's College of Arts and
I'm
Sciences.
Jack Russell Weinstein, host of Why?
Visit us online at whyradioshow.org.
Today we welcome our guest Lowry Pressly for a conversation I'm calling Privacy Isn't What You Think It Is. I'm Jack Russell Weinstein, host of Why? Philosophical Discussions with my wife for 25 Today we welcome our guest Lowry We've partnered through the best and worst of our lives, Privacy Isn't What You Doldrums and clutching one another in panic. I've been with my wife. If she wanted to, my wife could decimate me with a single sentence. Through the best I could do the same to her. As I tell my students, this is why couples have to learn how to fight panic. We know too much about each other. If she wanted to, my wife could decimate me with a single sentence. I could do the same to her. As I tell my students, this is why couples have to learn how to fight. The first is that everyone deserves something that is theirs alone. Maybe it's a story we never tell or a fantasy we hide deep in the darkness. Two facts. Some people have goals they never say out loud. The first is that everyone deserves others engage in superstitious rituals. Maybe it's a story we never tell or a fantasy we hide deep in the darkness. None of this. Some people have goals they never say out loud. One of our friends recently revealed that he often goes to the local guitar shop on the way home from work. His wife was flabbergasted. Another admitted that he sneaks away sometimes for one of our friends recently revealed that he often goes. He's from England, and he calls this getting a cheeky burger. His wife was flabbergasted. Both of these revelations are that he sneaks away sometimes for a self-indulgent, unhealthy snack. The content of those from England we keep for ourselves is largely irrelevant. Getting a cheeky burger. What makes them important is that they are by us, for us, simply and on our own terms. We choose how to value the content of those. There is an integrity to individuality that should not be violated by complete transparency. Nobody should know everything about anyone. We choose how to value the second complexity for togetherness is that sometimes our partners don't know things about us because we don't know them either. Human beings grow and change. We have nuanced, layered history. The second complexity our conscious justifications often eclipse our actual motives. Don't know things about us because we normalize absurdities we miss in the mirror every change. We have nuanced. What kind of person would we be if we won the lottery? Would we frame someone else to keep our motives? What would we have been like if that thing hadn't happened when we were younger? What kind of person would we be? Just as no one should be completely exposed, nobody can be entirely predictable. Therapy, frankly, life as a whole, is built on the recognition that most any action can be. Just as no one should be completely exposed, no behavior is a foregone conclusion. Therapy, frankly, life as a whole, both of these scenarios are examples of privacy. Most any action, that which is ours alone, is private in the sense that we choose not to reveal. No behavior is deliberate in our boundaries and strategic in keeping people away. Both of these scenarios, that which is unknown, because it is unpredictable, that which is ours alone, because it hasn't happened yet. There's something affirming about in our boundaries and strategic in keeping people away. We are free creatures. That which is unknown is never consequential because it is unpredictable, is private because it hasn't happened yet. On today's episode, something affirming our guest will put forth a theory of privacy that challenges our normal use of freedom is never consequential. He won't complain that our webcams surveil us or that the government is reading our emails, although our guest will put forth a theory of privacy. Instead, he will argue that privacy is a component of humanness. He won't complain that it is necessary for making us who we are. This is counterintuitive because defining ourselves in terms of the unknown makes us more enigmatic than identifiable. That we aren't gaining knowledge by emphasizing these kinds of privacy. This is counterintuitive because defining ourselves in terms of the unknown makes us more enigmatic. Oblivion is our guest words identifiable. He'll provide more details, of course, knowledge, but simply it refers to privacy without content. He will argue. This is different than understanding privacy as controlling Oblivion is our guest information. Oblivion provides more details, the idea that what is not known can always be communicated. Privacy without content. Now, this is abstract stuff. Different than understanding privacy as controlling secret information. Here's how I'd like you to start thinking about it. Oblivion rejects the idea that what is not known can always be communicated. Now, the understanding that things remain in existence even when we don't experience them. Here's how I'd like you to start thinking. A young child enjoys peekaboo because they are delighted when their playmate leaves, the understanding that things remain in existence. They haven't learned that the world is still there when their eyes are closed. Or to steal a line from the songwriter Ani DeFranco, a goldfish has no object permanence because they have no memory. The world is still little plastic when their eyes are closed. A surprise every time. Or to steal a line from the songwriter Ani DeFranco, imagine your partner goes into your bedroom and closes the door because they have no memory. What do you still know? They're little. Unlike the baby, you recall that they have to walk around the bed, that the loose floorboard will creak. Imagine your partner goes into your bedroom. If we accept that our partner is still in the room, what do you still know? We understand that they are limited in what they they have to walk around the bed, that the loose floorboard reject will creak, object permanency. They'll shut the blinds. Consider the possibility that once they close the door, we understand that they no longer know whether they exist or not. Sure, they could be on the bed, but they could also be in Times Square or dissolved into thin air. Consider the possibility that once they close the door about what they're doing specifically, you no longer know whether they exist or not. It's that suddenly, sure, they could be on the bed, but they could also be in Times Square or dissolved into thin air. This is the ultimate privacy. It's not that we aren't certain about what they're doing specifically. These are existential challenges to how we view the world. Our knowledge they get to the heart of what it means to know and to be. This is the ultimate privacy. I'm citing them to prepare us for thinking about the private in a new way. These are existential challenges to how we need to flourish as people. They get to the heart of what it means to know. What can we learn by turning the camera lens on ourselves and thinking about the private in a new way? If being private what kind of just privacy protection from corporations and peeping privacy a good in itself? We have to justify it politically. What can we learn by turning the camera lens on ourselves? But if it is, as our guest will argue, an essential element of becoming a protection from corporations, then privacy is much more. We have to justify sacrificing it. Becomes but if unthinkable. It is, as our guest will argue, and now our guest, Lowry Pressley is a writer and teacher currently in the Department of Political Science at Stanford University, as well as the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society and Stanford Civics. And now our guest, Lowry Pressley is a writer and teacher, Privacy and the Good Life, was published last at Stanford University, as well as the McCoy Family Lowry, Center welcome to Why Society and Stanford.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
The Right to Oblivion, Privacy and the Good Life. To our listeners, if you'd like to participate, please share your favorite moments from the show. And Lowry, welcome to Why Networks. Our handle is always
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
WHY Radio Show. Rate us on iTunes, Spotify, or your preferred podcast platforms so that the others can find the show and listen to all 17 seasons worth of episodes for free, as well as our sister show. Rate us on iTunes, Spotify, or your preferred podcast platforms so that the others can find the show. The show can only happen with your support. 17 solely on listener contributions for free, as well as our sister show. Click donate in the upper right-hand corner of our website to make your tax-deductible donation. And as always, the University of North Dakota Alumni Foundation portal. We exist solely on listener contributions. All right, so Lowry, I want to start by asking you a leading question. Deductible donations. So many of us post everything online, from our most mundane to our most intimate activities. So Lowry, I want to start a few years back by asking you a leading question. The author of Weapons of Mass Destruction, so many of us had a conversation about how at some point everyone will have their nudes online, and you're actually going to look suspicious. A few years back, me and my guest Kathy O'Neill, the author adjusting for hyperbole. My question is: had a conversation about how at some point everyone will have their nudes online, so and you're actually going to look suspicious if you haven't posted them.
Taking for the sake of argument that we will all take nudes in the future that we can then post, which I don't think we've quite gotten there yet.
Privacy.
It's a really provocative suggestion. I think it's meant, we will all take nudes. A bit hyperbolic. It's meant to be provocative. But even so, I don't think we've quite gotten there yet. First, I don't think it's a really provocative suggestion. Exhibitionists on the whole, as you said, that is like hyperbolic. Because the many offline domains. But even so, I don't think the provocation is vastly outnumber the opportunities you have for digital exhibitionists on the whole. So, as you mentioned in your monologue, offline the ways of privacy are extremely varied. We still care about it outnumber the opportunities. Home and bedroom, we still respond to invasive questions. As you mentioned in your monologue, saying that's the ways of privacy are none of your business varied, and so on. So still care privacy still structures so much home in the bedroom of our lives. Still respond. The vast majority of which doesn't questions. By saying that's what the provocation does. Business is something that I think actually quite common in the way that we talk and think about privacy. The vast majority today is that it takes a part of what the provocation does and mistakenly is something that I think stand actually quite common in this case in the way that we talk and think about digital privacy. And we today typically is that it do something even more specific of human life, social media, and mistakenly data has whatever. And in this case, the privacy norms that those things seem to express, and then have that typically stand use something even more specific for how we value like privacy as such, or big data. I just don't think that's accurate. And even the small thing that the provocation is trying to get, and then have that for privacy in general as an indication for how I don't think that's really expresses what it seems. I just don't think that's accurate. What the provocation wants it to. I think that very few of us is trying to get actually letting it all hang out. Even online. I don't think that statement is a bit expressive these days. Don't care about privacy, which I hear a lot when I get provocation. Once it really, most of what you see online, most of what my actually letting it all hang out, even online, are like a bit of curated images. Don't care about privacy, which I hear a lot. Slyly edited, extremely sophisticated. Really, most of what you see online, day in the life, what my on TikTok college students, or those very curated pictures, the kind of things on Instagram, curated images. They're all on LinkedIn. Slyly edited, they're not live blogging. Extremely sophisticated. So I think even in the very specific dimension, I think very curated overshadows things on Instagram. Fact that actually these norms about privacy, they're not live blogging, proper reach of information, so I think are even still in the very specific dimension. I think the kids overshadows online. The fact that actually
I think it's a really
norms
important
about privacy and
that
the proper reach of information
we are
overemphasizing
our digital life, and that
the kids.
So much online. Of what we do, I think it's a really important is separate from that, and that I'm going to want to pull that thread emphasizing our digital life, but and that you made the point about curation and that they're not live streaming their breakfast. I'm going to want to pull that thread again in when we edit. You made the point about when we curation and that they're not control the live streaming their breakfast. Can that and so I wonder be when the other side of the coin of privacy, images, when we, in the sense that we are told to describe posting these images as I have exhibitionism or performing for other people. But if we're adjusting them and making ourselves better or controlling these images, then we're really hiding behind them. Exhibitionism, does that curation for other people open the door for a wider understanding of privacy? The story, then we're really hiding conversation allows us to have. Does that curation?
I think so. The idea that privacy, for what it's for, its value, has to do with like permitting us to project highly curated images, not just online, but in different contexts. What it's for, offline life that predated the internet and these sorts of theories, like permitting us to. I think those highly curated images, not just online, but in like different contexts. For one thing, the value of privacy in this case is based upon publicity. I think those are also someone who wasn't interested in that or who was the same in public and private. For one thing, they assuming the value of privacy in this case wouldn't have is based upon publicity, and we tend to think that it's the kind of thing that everybody, someone who wasn't interested in that or who was the same in public and private. And I also think that assuming part of the danger of the idea that it's like privacy. The point of privacy is that it's the kind of thing that everybody let us project has a certain kind of image out into the public. Think, of course, it's important to do that. The danger of what it does is that it does a couple things. The point of privacy is that it overshadows, project the kinds of image out into the public. Of course, it's important to do that. So by making privacy the value of privacy derivative, one, its usefulness it overshadows curating our publicity, the kinds of goods that we can get really just privacy takes off the page. So by making privacy the value from privacy itself, and I think of its usefulness. Lots of us have experience with curating our publicity. Talked about it in your monologue. Really, just it also has it makes the same mistake that I think pretty much itself. And I think contemporaries have experience with that in legislation and your advocacy monologue. But about it also has which is that it just takes for granted that I think what privacy is for controlling our information, for letting some of it out, maybe some of it out in some contexts, and not in others, or letting some of it out, which is that it just takes for granted that privacy is for controlling our information. That's a view of secrecy, some of it out, confidentiality, maybe some of it out in some contexts, I think that's a mistake, and not in others, or letting some of it out. And
this is the first pivot point in the book.
But that's a
it's an
view
important
of secrecy
shift
or confidentiality.
Very conceptually interesting.
So I think that's a mistake.
Before we elaborate on pivot point your theory of privacy, can you talk a little bit more about this idea of how and these are my words, not yours, elaborate on understanding privacy in terms of controlling information. Can you talk a little bit more about this idea of the conversation begs the question? And these are my words, not yours, but assumes only a small possibility in terms of controlling information. Not already about your theory yet. The conversation. What's wrong about the way that we talk about privacy when we talk about it as secrecy or controlling information? Where does that go wrong? Yet?
Great. I'll give maybe two reasons what goes wrong. One that is one that you mentioned about question begging, a conceptual reason. Not the only one, but it's the one that your question raises. And then maybe two reasons what goes wrong. One reason that is the one that you mentioned about question begging. So the question begging, conceptual reason, technical term of art among philosophers for just assuming the conclusion raises, and then an argument sets out ethical to prove reason aspect of these theories. So the question begging. Let me give an example of privacy. Technical Joe Schmo of art among philosophers for just an embarrassing conclusion on that an argument sets out or a pornographic magazine in aspects of these theories. You then let me give an example into his laptop and see the photo, or you use X-ray and vision or whatever goggles to see the magazine, and you violate his privacy that way. So what does privacy protect? And you then the photo or text the magazine or see the photo, or you use X-ray vision or whatever. Question-begging mistake is that's what we get from a privacy violation. That way, you see the photo or the magazine or whatever, but that doesn't prove that's what you get from privacy or whatever. It only shows that's what you get from a question-begging violation. That's what we get from a privacy violation. And to show what you get from privacy, you'd have to have an example of somebody who has privacy. Magazine or and what would you be able to say about it? You wouldn't be able to say that they had a privacy. It only shows that's what you get or whatever. You'd just be able to say. And to show what you get from privacy, you have to have an example of somebody who has privacy. You wouldn't be able to and what would you be able to say about it? You wouldn't be able to say that they had a photograph line of thinking, magazine or whatever you get from a privacy violation. I don't know. To be what you get from privacy. But that's still a laptop. You wouldn't be able to say. And what's there. This long demonstrable line of thinking takes big dangers. And this is a danger not just for philosophers, to be what advocates and lawmakers and policymakers, people who really care about privacy and private life and all the sorts of dangers. The big dangers, and this is a danger not just for philosophers, very real, and I don't want but for advocates and lawmakers and policymakers, as a defense of privacy, this idea that it's about private life and all the sorts of dangerous information or digital flows and so on, all very real, and I don't want hamstrung from the get-go. And the reason it is because it accepts this idea that it's about its enemies or protecting, or its, let's say, opponents' information or views before it gets started. And this is the idea that the information, and the reason always already pre-premise of its enemies, the question of its privacy. And then when we're talking about privacy, what we're really asking is, where does it go? How do we control it? What happens when somebody gets it and we don't want it? What already pre-exists? And so on. The question. And by taking for granted that information just has, what we're really asking is, where does it go? How do we control it in our lives? When somebody gets it prior to the ethical and political question and so on privacy, and by taking for privacy granted advocates and theorists give the game away natural who the presence I think generally take to be the biggest prior to the ethical and political question, big data and so on. This is thinking privacy in privacy advocates and theorists give the game away on Facebook who I think Instagram or social media threats to privacy, where you can sort of big data decide so on. What audience sees your stuff, scare quotes, privacy, but you don't get to decide whether Facebook, any information or created Instagram or social media, and you don't get to decide whether Facebook you can or TikTok or whoever audience sees at that point. It matters little, but you don't get to decide whether any states who we see as the biggest threats today, don't get to decide how we control the limits of our audience, TikTok or whoever with our information, because they already have it. It matters little. And so that's a big political thing. Who we see as the biggest threats today gives the game away. How we control the limits of our audience, publicity, defenses of privacy, because they already against the invasions of the digital age. That's a big political.
We're going to talk a little bit more about information in a minute, what that means in the context of what you're talking about, because I think it's very abstract and it needs a little more attention than we're going to talk a little bit more about information in a minute, what that means. The word in the context of what you're enemy in your answer, and then you revised it to say a little more attention than what I'm curious about is privacy a term that the word necessarily enemy in your answer, and then you assumes conflict. That necessarily assumes a zero-sum interaction. About it is that there's always an opponent. That whatever it is about privacy, since there's the private, assumes the not private, the exposure. That necessarily that there's a zero-sum interaction. Conflict inherent. That there's always an opponent. That whatever it is about privacy, since there's the necessary element of not private, the exposure. That there's a conflict inherent, striving to overcome it.
Yeah, that's a great question. Privacy, I think, in some ways naturally fits into this sort of oppositional mode, but I want to go ahead and answer the question. Say, I don't think. Yeah, that's a great question. It has to be that way, and privacy, sometimes I think in some ways naturally useful to think of it that way. But maybe it naturally fits into a sort of mode, but I don't adversarial understanding. Answer the question because it's a kind of protection. It has to be that way, and sometimes it's maybe not. And that's what it is. It's an epistemic barrier. But maybe it naturally fits into a sort of the laptop, the way that we treat one another, and not. Because it's a kind of limit against what we can knowledge about others. And that's what it is. And epistemic barrier, similar limits. It might not be walls, privacy exactly, but the way that we treat one another that I talk about later in the book. It's a limit about limits to what we can know about ourselves. About others, there is a kind of there are similar limits. At least might not be a barrier. And it's a good barrier. And it doesn't just protect value that I talk about later in the book. Goods about limits to what we can. But you might think there is a kind of, in some ways it naturally it's at least into a barrier. An idea of opposition. It's a good barrier because it doesn't just protect some barrier, but that's That's true about all sorts
you might
of
think
values.
Okay, in
all
some ways,
the ways of obscurity and concealment
an idea of opposition.
So many.
Privacy isn't the only way that we.
That's true about all sorts of values.
Others,
and even
the ways
values
of
that
obscurity
aren't
and concealment
that don't produce so many.
Barriers. Privacy isn't the only
Also,
way that we.
they might just as easily lend themselves to a conflictual understanding. And even values
freedom
that aren't
or liberty. And there's going to be cases where
barriers
that's going to
also
be in tension with the liberty of others or other interests.
Lend themselves that doesn't lead us to really understand liberty in an opposition.
Liberty, and there's going to be cases where.
And so
that's going
I think
to
what you point at
with the
is another
of others or other interests.
Not a conceptual.
That doesn't lead us to really
opposition or conceptual reason
liberty
for
in
our tendency to think that way, and for my perhaps for Freudian slip.
I think what you
but also a political
is another.
And this is that there is certainly
or conceptual
in my
reason
lifetime
and
our tendency to think that way.
9/11,
But I think
perhaps
for
much
Freudian slip
earlier.
But also
there
a political
is
one.
just there's
And
it's taken
this
for
is that
granted
there is
in the public
certainly
discourse about privacy
in my lifetime
that it's something
and
that's
after
in 9/11,
central
but I think
conflict
much
of value.
earlier,
Especially after
there
9/11, it was
is
security.
just there's
Privacy and
granted
security are just
in the public
intentions, and you're
discourse
going to have
about
to strike a
privacy,
balance, which
that it's
means
something that's
you're going to have to
in
give up
essential
one or the other.
conflict
If we have this weak
about
idea of privacy that we were just
especially after
discussing,
9/11, it
and
was
security,
the safety
privacy
and
and
lives of
security
my
are
friends
just
and
intentions.
family.
You're going to have
That's
to strike
gonna
a
be a
balance,
hard
which means
balance.
you're going to have to give up
Right.
one or the other. And
But
if we have this weak
I think
idea of
it's
privacy that
telling
we were just
that-
discussing, and it's security,
That's true about all
safety and lives
values.
of my
It's also
friends
true
and family,
about liberty.
That's going to be a hard
The liberty that
balance
we allow people
strike. Is
But
also going to be in
I think it's
tension
telling
with security
that
property rights.
That's true about
protections
all
against trespass
values.
They can also
true
about
about
something
liberty.
that's lobbed at privacy
The liberty
sometimes
that we
protect
allow
people
who
are doing
is
bad
also
things.
going to
But
be
you
in
never hear
tension
with
with
property
security.
to let
Property
people get
rights.
away with bad
Protections
things
against
because they're
trespass.
doing it in
They can also,
or in
this
the
is something
woods
that's lobbed at
where you
privacy
can't
sometimes,
see it. So
protect
I
people
think
who are doing
there
bad
is
things. But you
certainly
never
in the
hear
contemporary
that property is
era
to let people get
a
away
degree
with bad
of,
things. 'Cause
I'll
they're
say
doing
like
it in
maybe
the
ideological
in the
pressure,
woods, where
if
you
not
can't
like overt
see
bad
it. So
faith.
I think there
that
is
sort of
certainly in
compels
the
us to
contemporary
single out
era
privacy
a degree
as a
of,
kind of,
I'll say like
interest
maybe
or
ideological
value
pressure
that is in some way
if not like
opposed to
overt
these
bad
other
faith.
things that we like
That
in a different
sort of
way than
compels
all
us
of the
to
other values.
single out
And I think that's
privacy
just been
as
a
a
product
kind
both
of
of the interest
sort of for value
ideology
that is in some way
the information
opposed to
age,
these
other
digital
things that we like
economy
in a different way
and
than
also
all
the
of
real
the other
renewal
values. And I think
of
that's
citizen
just been
surveillance
product
for
both
the-
of the
attacks of September 11th.
ideology of
There's a lot
the information
there
age
to unpack, and when
economy
we come
and
back
also
from the
real
break,
renewal
I'm going to
of
start to
citizen
ask you
surveillance
about
for the
your
attacks of
term
September 11th.
Oblivion, and there's a lot there to unpack. Help construct the vision of privacy that you want to present. I'm going to start to ask you about. You're listening to Lowry Pressley and Jack Russell Weinstein on Why Philosophical Discussions about Everyday Life. We'll be back right after this. Construct the vision of privacy that you want to present. For now, you're listening to Lowry Pressley and Jack Russell Weinstein on Why Philosophical Discussions about Everyday Life. We'll be back right after this.
The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life bridges the gap between academic philosophy and the general public. Its mission is to cultivate discussion between philosophy professionals and others who have an interest in the subject, regardless of experience or credentials. Between academic philosophy Visit us on the web at philosophyandpubliclife.org. Cultivate discussion the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, others who have an interest in the subject, because there is no ivory tower of experience or credentials. Visit us on the web at philosophyandpubliclife.org. The Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, because there is no ivory tower.
And you're back with Why Philosophical Discussions about Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. We're talking with Lowry Pressley about privacy, what it might be, and eventually how it connects to human flourishing, fulfilling what it means Jack Russell Weinstein. We're talking a person. With Pressley, and in the process privacy, of the what it conversation be, just a moment ago, and eventually how it connects to human flourishing, fulfilling what it means to be. Longtime listeners will know we talk epistemology all the time. Epistemology is the study of knowledge, the study of the nature and limits of knowledge. And the point that he was making is that things may appear to be barriers, but epistemology all the time. That's only from one perspective. So imagine you are wearing rose-colored glasses. You're wearing tinted, red-tinted sunglasses. But that's a barrier. That's only from one perspective. A certain kind of color. You are and you take them off, wearing the world in rose-colored glasses. You're wearing regular glasses, and without them, you see the world in a different way. And not having the glasses is the barrier. Whereas putting the glasses on helps clarify things. what this sets up is that when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to epistemology, not having the glasses is the we barrier, can take any variable, any tool, any factor, and say, what this here is what it reveals, when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to epistemology, and we can take that's true of everything, variable, not just any privacy, tool, any factor, and Lowry, say, with that in mind, here is what it reveals, you and I have been using this term information, and in the sense that privacy that's true of everything to protect information. Privacy. And so, Lowry, with that in mind, one of the oppositions, one of the flip sides of that in your book is this notion of Oblivion that I mentioned in the monologue. Presumed to protect information. What is information? And what is oppositions? One of the flip sides of that. And what do we learn about Oblivion that I mentioned? Knowledge in general. That's a massive question. What do we learn about knowledge by contrasting Oblivion? What you were calling about information, knowledge in general, this concept of Oblivion question. What do we learn about?
That's a great question and a big question. And can I get to that? But can I first respond to something you said that I think is so profound in that question? Is that talking about these epistemic barriers or limits a big question and to knowledge? And you said, but can I first reveal and hide you said that I think is so profound? And I think that's an extraordinary profound talking about statement epistemic, and it's also something I think that is completely and you said absent. They each reveal discourse on privacy, in part because it is counterintuitive. We don't think about like walls statement as revealing something. I think they just keep something away from. So maybe before we talk about information and Oblivion, counterintuitive. It might be worth saying a word about, or at least me trying to expand on what you're saying. They just keep something. I think it is away so important. So maybe before we talk about information and Oblivion, not all barriers. It might be worth saying a word about, and at least me also they reveal different things. We get something. So important from you said two things. The one I like to use not all barriers to limit contrast against privacy and also they reveal different things. This will get to the information versus different. Oblivion point secrecy conceals. The one I like to use information to contrast privacy. Privacy conceals limit of secrecy. Oblivion. This will get to the information. Just like before I get to those kinds of abstract ideas, information. Let me give privacy. That might make it seals and produces. So let's think. Oblivion. You could think about the difference. Just like before I get to those kinds of abstract thinking of your friends from your intro, give an example. Our friends that might make secret life plausible. So on one hand, you could think about the private life and what we talk about when we talk about secret life. Thinking of your friends from your intro there. Our friends, something that we can turn into information. Maybe it's on one hand. Maybe it's an embarrassing hobby, or he goes, it's a cheeky secret life. It refers to, there's some reference of the private life. It's much more general. We can turn into information. Maybe it's an ordinary. Maybe it's an embarrassing hobby. For something to be a secret, there's got to be some definite information. But the reference of the private life person, much more general so that I go to get the. So for something to be a secret, there's got to be some definite information, something known by at least one person. And so if our friend doesn't actually have this kind of information, or he isn't actually sneaking around, then he doesn't have secrets or a secret life. Secret life evaporates. Our friend either by discovering the hidden truth about it, or by there being information, or he isn't actually sneaking around, then he doesn't. Turns out our friend isn't going to the guitar center or getting cheeky burgers. He's just the way that he appears. Then he doesn't have a secret life. Or by there being nothing. We can't say the same in the first place about his private life. Turns out our friend isn't going to the guitar center or getting cheeky burgers. He's just the way that he appears. Then he doesn't have a secret. His private didn't have. We can't say the same way. We can easily say about his private secrecy. Except maybe that he lives in a glass house. Come up with a counterfactual. Dreamed as every waking moment to the internet, and even then we'd have to say that he has something like mental privacy. Same way we can easily say whatever secrecy, and maybe this is because what privacy protects dreamed as every isn't waking moment particular to the internet, and even then we'd have to say that he has something like can be mental privacy, definite way or whatever, but protects. And this is because what privacy protects. In the first place. A particular kind of information.
Imagine a particular thing I have a colleague,
definite way,
and
but protects against
someone asks me what kind of music do they like, and I say I asked them about it, but they really didn't want to talk about it, and they didn't want to tell me anything. They wanted to keep it professional. Someone asks me what kind of music do they like. But if someone asks me what kind of music they like, and I say them about it, but never really want to talk about it, and they didn't want to tell me anything. They wanted to keep it professional. Person who listens to music at all. But if someone asked me what kind of music they like, completely oblivious when it comes to that information, it just doesn't occur to me. That's more like privacy. If I understand correctly, that the secrecy is There's something there someone's keeping from it, or you can't access to that information. But privacy doesn't occur is an absence. That's more like it's a missing piece. If I understand correctly, a synonym for Oblivion, it's a void. Am I understanding someone's keeping analogically? You can't access to it. But privacy,
maybe it'll be more intuitively plausible if it's not music, but it's something that in our culture we tend to think is private information. It's the subject of an invasive question. Maybe it'll be more intuitively plausible if it's not music, but it's something that in our culture we tend to have children, private, non-adopted children. It's the subject of an invasive question. It's happening. It's an ordinary thing, or what you do in the bathroom. We all know what goes on in the bathroom. Whether you have sex with your spouse, but have children, non-adopted children. It's when we respond to those kinds of it's an ordinary thing. What we say is, and it could be music, it maybe be eccentric, no secret. What we say is, no, that's none of your business. Nevertheless, or we say that's when we respond to those kinds of questions, and you can we say is, and it could be somebody says how much money, but I just what we say is, no, that's none of your business. I seem to have failed. We say that's the invasive whatever question. Because what I've done, you can is I've somebody says given a piece of inaccurate information. A lie can preserve what I seem to have failed to fend off, but it can't preserve my privacy because now what I've done has what I didn't want produced. I've given a piece of inaccurate information. So a lie can preserve my secret, even though in this case inaccurate. It can't preserve my so that's privacy. Why even if we blush, if somebody asks us an embarrassing or a question that we'd like to keep about whose answer we'd like to keep private, even though if we blush, we feel like we failed. And so that's why even if we blush, if somebody asks us an embarrassing or a question that we would like, this is because we're even though we may not be revealing the truth about the blush, we feel like we failed. We're revealing something when what we want is to have a degree of ambiguity on the matter. This is because we're even though we may not be revealing the truth to Oblivion, we want them to be oblivious. We're revealing something. Not to think we want how much is to have a degree of ambiguity on the matter, and not to just have the other person. To use an analogous term to Oblivion, we want them to be oblivious.
Want to ask a question
about how much
but I feel like asking the question is going to presume the nature of the debate that we're trying to walk away from. But I'm going to ask it anyway. When you are talking about blushing, giving information, presume the immediate opposite came to my mind as a poker face is completely. But I'm going to ask it anyway. When you but someone's going to come along and say the immediate opposite came to my mind as a poker face is completely this is none of your business. But someone's going to come along and say you're hiding. So why would the shift that you say I'd like this is to ask you about that opens up your more your deeper conceptual conversation is the shift why would something not be someone else's business opens up if you're not hiding or ashamed or secret is what is why would something what is it be what is the value of what you're protecting you're not by establishing those boundaries or secret, especially when someone is going to come along and say look if you have nothing to shame of what is it just say what you want. Is the don't plead the Fifth Amendment if you're not guilty of something. So by establishing those boundaries what is it that especially when someone's going to come along none of your business establishes of just say what you want. Don't plead the Fifth Amendment if you're not guilty of something. So what is it that
and this gets back to your great point about how different limits or different forms of epistemic barrier concealment they give us something different. One of the things they give us, and this gets back to your best way to put it, point they elicit different limits or different forms. And again, I think it's one of the big mistakes in the something different history of one of the things thinking about privacy. At least philosophers, the best way to put it, but they elicit different sorts of reactions. And again, I think it's one of the forms of concealment mistakes are meaningfully different. And that's why we have all these words. At least, and one of the ways in which they're different is that we react to the different forms of concealment. With this example, are meaningfully different. And that's why we have all these information. And one of the ways in which the thing that our friend isn't sharing with us react as hidden. We think he's hiding. Example, keeping it secret. If we treat the information, then we're inclined, even if he doesn't tell us, we're inclined to think sharing with definitely something as hidden. And we're inclined to be suspicious. Keeping it secret. If I quickly move my hand behind my back or something, and we're inclined, even if he doesn't tell us, it's almost inclined to think that there's definitely something there, and we're inclined to be suspicious. And what we get from privacy, my hand certainly what we want from privacy, you're like, is for people not to regard us in that way, to not want to know when they walk by my office door on it, to put their ear, what we get from to just slow down. What we want from privacy, or is just for people not to regard us in that way, to not going on. What I want is them to just walk by office door and not put their ear, or to just slow down. And so this is, you can scale this up to the level of society and build out your point. Something by saying how we as a society and understand privacy and hiding and what the difference is, we can scale this up to the level of society and build out your point society-wide by saying how we the kinds of relations understand one another, privacy, kinds of hiding and what the difference is, and what it's like and so on. To walk by has huge society-wide effect someone for the kinds of relations that we have. Do we regard them with suspicion that we because we don't know what it's like? Do we treat their privacy as hiding, in other words, people having, or do we treat it as something they have in their moral right to, and so on? Do we regard them with suspicion because we don't know? And then we'll leave it up. Privacy is hiding, in other words, individuals, or do we treat it as something they have to decide more or less what the boundaries are? So if it's zone, if music, what music you like, might not tend to be that kind of thing, but there might be someone who finds it very burdensome or embarrassing to talk about that in public. They don't want to admit music. What Spotify Wrapped came up might not tend to be that kind of thing, but there might be someone the top album listened to or something. And free society thinks that's okay. We want that person to be, don't want to admit a quarter the Spotify Wrapped came up, unknowing K-pop demon privacy, as opposed to the suspicious listened to or something. And free society thinks that's okay. We want that person to be.
I just have to say that growing up as a punk rocker in New York City in the 1980s,
as opposed to the suspicious
worst secret that you could reveal was having a wham. I just have to say that growing up as a punk rocker in New York City in the 1980s, and worst secret that you could reveal was having a wham cassette. And when we attach it to identity, there are all sorts of values. And again, tell me if I'm getting this right. Instead of the dead Kennedys, you talked about different kinds of concealment and different kinds of concealment have different values. There are all sorts of values. I could say I'm hiding something, and that you talked about means different thing. I can say I'm obscuring something, different values, and that is going to have a different sort of level of concern. And I can say I'm distracting from something. I can say, and that's going to have a whole different set of concerns. And that is each of those definitions are going to have values, and I can say I'm intensity and agency attached to them. Whereas a whole different set of concerns, and so we want to detach from any are going to have values and judgments. We don't want to ask how intense is your privacy, because then it's secrecy, it's not privacy. We don't want to ask what's the agency in your privacy, because then it's judgment, distracting people or calling attention to something else, right? Because then am I getting this right? That part of what we're trying to do is detach judgments, distracting from or calling attention to something else, privacy. Because am I getting this right? That part of what we're trying to do is it at all. Detach what your judgments.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think we ought to be more attentive, as you drew out, the various modes of concealment, of dissembling or not being known. I think it's a wonderful multiplicity, and they all have their place. I think we need secrets. You drew out. We need various modes. I think we need hiding in some cases, or we would want to hide. It can be fun to hide. Wonderful multiplicity, and they all have their place. I think we need secrets. Privacy isn't just the conceptual running together of all these different kinds, or we would want to hide, or having limits to knowledge. But also, it's part of we give a bad rap. Problem with privacy isn't just the conceptual secrecy running together. Actually, it can be, and of course, it can be used bad. The value of secrecy and hiding knowledge to be, but also it's on what's being given a bad rap. But it can form a part of a good life. And actually, it can be, and of course, it can be used bad. You start off your book by talking about to be the introduction of the camera, but it can and how the camera itself inspired also this modern discussion of privacy, and that the introduction of the conversation in newspapers. It wasn't just philosophers; it was the media of the time. This modern discussion. One would imagine that you're doing that appeared in prefigure conversation in newspapers. It wasn't discussion about data privacy, the media of the tracking ourselves and things like that. But one would you actually use a couple of examples to show that
discussion about data privacy and took something away from people's things like that, agency. But you actually by use a couple of examples, placing them in other situations to show. Can you recall the example of the advertisement away from you talked about agency? It was the woman in the costume. Placing them in other situations. Was the concern the example of the advertisement initiated that wasn't about information, but was about identity and agency? How did the camera bring this up? That
our ideas of privacy basically emerged in reaction to the first information, mass media, but was newspapers particularly, but later it was also occurred with radio. And then the first kind of privacy, basically technology that really, I think, figures a lot of what our digital world is mass media, so image-based newspapers, particularly, and then the complaints there very much resemble the same complaints that we have today. So people are complained about, really, I think, complaining the language of our digital world is like in about spy cameras, kind of thing that can be hidden in a book. Very much resemble the same that are meant to take today. So people are complaining about complaining in the language of privacy taken in candidly spy cameras. Very similar to the now Meta glasses or the previous Google Glass, which meant to take worried and were reaching for the language of privacy. That was about the fear of being our pictures being taken. Obviously, that are very similar to the now Meta glasses. And so there is a kind of continuity of concern there, and we're reaching for the language of privacy. But there was the early privacy advocates in the 19th century, mostly ordinary folks. They got there a lot earlier, but in philosophers. And so there is a kind of continuity of concern. They were concerned. There was, I think, at a more fundamental level in the 19th century, mostly human well-being and injuries to human person philosophers. So the earliest responded. These are two of the earliest. They were concerned. I think at a more fundamental level about actual human well-being, privacy, and before the philosophy. So these earliest people, these are reacting in real time to the new invention of right snapshot. And these camera before and the actual economy of photographs and before and saying there's something wrong. There's a new kind of reacting in real time to the new invention. There is snapshot camera about the camera and the new. And what's so interesting about these and saying there's something about privacy. Others are talking about the normal sort of privacy of the home, and they're all they're complaining about privacy of photographs that were taken in public. And what's so interesting about was photographed on talking about privacy. Others during her performance, she was an actress of the home that we know. So before a literal complaining about privacy of photographs. This is the early days of the flash woman. So the flash photograph on stage snapshot during her performance, she was an actress. Capture her. So in an instant before a literal public stage. And this is someone who appears in publicity. This is the early days of the flash also. So the flash, even dressed in the costume snapshot camera, is in a costume playing a role. But she says that this photograph was a violation. Who appears in publicity photograph. And then the second example that I talk about in the book was the first one to successfully vindicate a right to privacy. But she says in the court's photograph was a violation. And this is a man who had posed. And then the second example that I talk about in the book was the first one not to successfully vindicate a right to privacy. The first one courts and his picture was later used. And this is a man who had posed for an insurance in an advertising studio, so not the and the complaint in both cases was his picture was later used. One that it was a kind of invasion, an invasion of privacy, an invasion of the complaint in a way that isn't particularly well explained at the time, but you could tell that it's very one that it was a kind of invasion. More about that, and so an invasion of privacy, an invasion of tautologically of privacy, in a way that isn't particularly well explained. The other complaint was you could tell that the photograph forced someone to appear. More about that. So an invasion of a person to appear in places where they weren't. And then the physical person wasn't, and where they might not have chosen to go. Forced someone they didn't take themselves as the person who wills their body to appear in places and maybe wills images of the physical person wasn't to go, and where they might not. And it was a new complaint about photography that people weren't complaining about as the person sketches or body or paintings or and maybe just the impression that strangers on the street or the other on-camera wielding members of the audience had. They're also complaining about knowledge, memories, and so on away from there, just taking it to other places that the strangers on the street obviously can't on-camera wielding doesn't have really a right of the audience had. They're also taking something special knowledge and memories and so on away from there and taking it to other places that the performer obviously can't made and which doesn't have really a newly problematic and newly injurious something special person about the kind to appear in context, let's say where the physical person wasn't photographed and where they didn't made it newly problematic and newly injurious. Let me offer to the person an example, and again, tell me if I'm getting this right. Let's say someone and where they takes a picture of me.
and they put it on let me offer an example, refrigerator. Again, it's a big picture. If I'm getting this right. Let's say, and then that person happens to be a KKK member, and they put it and is having a KKK meeting in their refrigerator. Right, it's a big people you can't there looking at each other, and then that person happens to be a KKK member, see me and is having a KKK meeting, and in now their refrigerator, I am present and people in some way against my will. See my at a meeting that I would object to. Me on the refrigerator, and while in the modern terms I am present challenges in terms of integrity or just an accident or just don't associate me with this, that I would what object. It seems to be this initial complaint was that they are taking my identity, integrity or just an accident associating me with having me appear what it seems to be this I would not consent to was that and my ability they are to taking my what I'm associated with and should be thought of in terms of privacy, not in terms of other things. Is that a fair and my ability to
of the two versions of the 19th century complaints or the earliest complaints against photography? That's the one that might sound the most old-fashioned to us, but it certainly was one. And this is the judge said of the 19th century complaint, the earliest complaints, basically said as much. That's the one that might sound the most photograph appears where he doesn't want it is, but it certainly was one completely unfree. He even used the metaphor of slavery to the privacy of the United States. What this is doing said as much to someone's person, and it sounds a little weird. Photograph appears where he doesn't want it. You're not there, and completely wouldn't go to this meeting, and probably everybody knows it. And so what this is doing, it reflects something, and it sounds a little weird. People would think this way. Of course, like reflects something that was different. You wouldn't go to this meeting, and probably everybody something about the photograph made them feel that a part of something who they were, that people would think really themselves was reflects something that was different where they weren't, whereas just memories from the audience members, the photograph of the made them feel that a part of who they were do that. Or that they really it's not anything natural about the present photograph, but the way that we weren't, whereas just regard it. We regard it as like a window into reality. It's a piece of evidence about the way that it's not anything natural about you look at a photograph, but the way that we just without thinking, we as a window and think as if we're looking back in time. It's a piece of evidence to me when I was 3 years old and toddling around. Of course, I don't remember this, and I couldn't have anyway without seen thinking it from the perspective and think as if we're looking a picture of me back in time. And I think, yeah, there I am. When I was 3 years old and toddling around. It's not necessary to think that way, but that is certainly the way we treat photographs, even though from the very beginning, taking a picture of me. But I think, yeah, there I am. That's me. Photoshop. That's real. And there's the other complaint that was that way, but that is certainly the way we treat it. It wasn't just about being taken somewhere from the very beginning, or where you wouldn't go, or having your image with Photoshop. But it was that the other photograph was this new evidentiary way of just taking a slice, taken somewhere, peeling off the skins of the way things really having your image as Oliver Wendell Holmes. But it was that the photograph is that it evidentiary way of just taking a slice or like a fact. Peeling off the skins. And this is why there was such a focus on candid photographs, and why I think really privacy advocacy didn't get going until the invention of the snapshot. This is why there was such a long time there were these cameras, and why to take a good picture of you, but you had privacy advocacy had to didn't get going. We had to make a pretty straight invention in a studio snapshot for it to come out not blurry. For a long time, we had this technology thanks to George Eastman and others that you had to capture. You had to make a momentary facial expression for it to come out not blurry. It was suddenly we had still thought to reveal something George Eastman about and others that you can. So the bigger injury, I think, wasn't just the transportability facial expression, but was the camera seemed to present was thought and is still thought to reveal something about human social life. So the bigger injury, I think, wasn't just the transportability kind of fact, but was the camera seemed to present from the ordinary a new power of life as it's lived. So we don't notice social life. We don't tend to notice fleeting expression, kind of fact. We don't. We can't in our memory isolate from the ordinary memory as we remember it. We rewrite it. It's malleable. It's all we don't notice. We don't tend to notice fleeting. It's expressions. It's available for scrutiny. We can't in our memory, and it's portable. Memory, as we remember it, we rewrite it. It's malleable. This is why we today call photographs candid. Unposed pictures as candid. The original meaning of being candid is freely speaking one's heart, telling the truth about how one really feels. This is why we today call. So now the idea is we have these unposed technology as candid that can get that out of a person.
freely speaking
one's
heart.
So that is to say
against
about how one really
and
feels.
that really worried.
And so now the idea is we have, and I think we still have
technology
analogous concerns
that
can get that out of a person
I'm really interested
when they're
in
not
this
guarded. So
idea
that is to say
of
against their will. And
taking
that really
this
worried
slice
people at the
of
time. And I think we
movement
still have
and making it
analogous
into a
concerns
fact
today.
and unto itself.
I'm really
And
interested
I-
in this
I-
idea.
I have two
of
different competing examples in my
taking
head.
this
The first
slice
is
of
that
movement and making
many
it
of us
into a
have known
fact
people who were
unto
really
itself
very
and
attractive,
but
I
not photogenic.
I have two different
and what
competing
made them
examples in my
attractive
head.
was
the first
their
is
facial
that expressions and their movements.
Many of us
and-
have
and,
known
and there was a
people who were
vibration about
really
them or
very
whatever.
attractive,
And
but
if you
not
took a picture of
photogenic.
them and
what
said,
made them
"This
attractive
is
was
their
Joe,
facial expressions,"
it
and their
would be
movements,
establishing
and
something
there
about
was a
Joe
vibration
as a
about them or
fact
whatever
that was
And
inaccurate.
if you took
That
a
was
picture
slice
of
of
them and
something
said,
this
and
is
misleading Joe,
And the other example,
it would be
I am of the
establishing
age
something
where
about
there was
Joe
as
a
a fact
television show
that
called
was
What's Happening,
inaccurate.
and there's a
That was a
big
slice of
episode of What's
something
Happening where the
and
main character
misleading.
rerun
And the other
sneaks a
example-
recording into a Doobie
I am
Brothers
of the
concert.
age
For
where
people
there
of my
was
age, this is a
television
formative
show called
memory,
What's
I
Happening,
assure you.
and there's a big
And
episode of
he
What's
sneaks a
Happening
recording
where the main
device into the
character
Doobie Brothers
rerun
concert,
sneaks a
and
recording into a Doobie
it
Brothers
falls
concert.
out and reveals
For people
itself.
of my
The
age,
Doobie
this
Brothers
is a
stop, and
formative
everyone is
memory, I assure you.
shocked.
And we are
he sneaks a recording
educated
device
to
into the Doobie
think of
Brothers
this as
concert,
secret
and
recording
as stealing someone's
it
intellectual
falls out and
property,
reveals itself
as
and the Doobie
having
Brothers
a
stop, and
recording
everyone
that
is
you can
shocked.
then
And
duplicate for
we
your
are
own
educated to think
means,
of this as
but
secret recording.
what it
as
sounds
stealing
like
someone's
one of the
intellectual
consequences
property,
of
as having
the camera
a
and the
recording
slice of
that you
time
can
is
then
that
duplicate for your
having
own
something recording
means
stops you from
what
being
it sounds
free.
like
It
one of the
stops you from
consequences
being
of
allowed to make a
the
mistake
camera and the
that
slice
will
of time
disappear
is that
in the ether, that will
having
hold you
something
to something
recording
permanent
stops
that
you
is
from
ephemeral.
being
It's
free. It
you and I
stops
are
you from
teachers in
being allowed to
contemporary
make a
world, and
mistake
there's
that will
always a risk that
disappear
someone is
in
going to
the ether,
record
that
our
will
class
hold you to something
without us knowing.
permanent
And if
that is
someone's recording the
ephemeral.
class,
You and I are
it's not that I
teachers
would
in
teach
contemporary world, and
differently.
there's
It's
always
that
a
I am
risk
so
that someone is gonna
stressed
record
about
our
what
class
I might without
accidentally
us knowing,
knowing, and if
that I
someone's
couldn't be
recording
a
the class,
free teacher.
it's not that I
So
would
these are the
teach
two examples that
differently.
come to mind.
It's
The
that I am so
inaccurate
stressed
solidification
about
of
what
a
I
person
might accidentally
that
say
doesn't describe
that I
them
couldn't be a
and
free
the
teacher.
limitations
So
of
these are the
freedom
two
to
examples
fully
that come to
express
mind.
yourself
The
when you're
inaccurate
recorded.
solidification
Am I
of
onto
a
something
person
and
that doesn't describe
is
them,
this a
and
good
the
use of the term
limitations
privacy
of freedom to fully
as
express
opposed
yourself when you're
to
recorded?
misrepresentation
or
intellectual property?
Is this a
Am I right
good
that
use of
these
the term
are
privacy
nuances of what
as
you're trying to
opposed
describe
to
in terms of
misrepresentation
privacy and ultimately
or intellectual
human flourishing,
property?
what it means to be
Am
a full
I
human
right
being?
that these are
The two examples really do get at
nuances
two
of what
aspects
you're
of this.
trying to describe?
So
in
one is
terms
that
of
one reason you might not
privacy
want
and
to be
ultimately
recorded,
human
you might not
flourishing,
want
what
to
it
have
means to be
a
a full human
documentary
being.
trail or information
The
produced
two examples
about
really
you
do
in the
get at
moment
two aspects
is that
of
bad consequences
So
can
one
ensue
is
if
that
you say
one
something
reason you
you
might
slip
not
up,
want to
it
be
might always
recorded,
follow you,
might not want to
therefore
have
you're
a
likely to be less
documentary trail or
spontaneous and
information
so on.
produced
And
about
this is
you
an
in the
idea
moment
that
is
was
that bad
original in the 19th
consequences
century,
can
and we've
ensue
lost
if you
to
say
some
something,
extent.
you slip up.
That
One thing privacy
follow
protects
you
is
therefore you're
kind of
likely to be less
spontaneous,
spontaneous,
the
and so
ability
on.
to be spontaneous,
And
the
this
kind
is
of
an idea
potentiality
that
in
was
human life
original in the
that
19th century, and
comes
we've lost
from
to
being
some
reasonably
extent,
confident
that
there's
one thing
no
privacy protects
information
is
being
this kind of
about
spontaneity.
what's going on
The
in the moment,
ability to be
but
spontaneous. The
there's
kind of
that's a
potentiality in human
consequentialist
life. It
argument.
comes
The
from being
second
reasonably
example you
confident
gave
that there's
it makes me
no
think of
information
what we talk about today about
everybody
what's
is
going
not
on
where
in
we
the moment.
lament that at
But
concerts
there's-
today.
that's about that's
not
a
that we're
consequentialist
making
argument.
a bootleg recording of the
second
Doobie Brothers, but
example
everybody's
you
on their
gave,
phones.
It makes
Recording
me think of
everything,
what we talk
and they're
about
not.
today about we
Everybody
complain,
is not
we
where we
old folks
lament
in the
that at
moment.
concerts
They're
today.
missing something about the
making a
experience.
bootleg
They're
recording of the
degrading
Doobie Brothers, but
They're not
everybody's
getting
on
the
their
full
phones.
experience.
Recording
because they're
everything,
concerned
and they're not
with
we complain
producing
old folks
a
in the
document
moment about
They're
it.
missing
They're thinking about
something about the
publicity. Who's going to see
experience.
this
They're degrading
video?
the experience.
And
They're not
so
getting
on.
the full experience.
And
Because
in the book,
they're
I
concerned
think about several
with
different types
producing
of
a document.
experiences
About it,
who
thinking about publicity,
who's going to see this video,
fundamental or
and
constitutive element,
and
an opposition.
in the book, I think about several different types
or knowledge
of experiences.
at least knowledge in the fact that philosophers call propositional. So knowledge as either
constitutive element,
X or not X, one thing or the other. Kind of knowledge,
information,
logic,
or knowledge
being moved.
at least knowledge.
Symphonies like this,
called propositional knowledge.
Physical intimacy,
either,
sex and love.
X or not
X,
one thing or
be
the
like
other.
this kind of knowledge.
And the thing that protects
being
this
idea,
symphonies like
the means
this,
of the first example,
physical intimacy,
in many
sex
cases,
and
is
love,
privacy. physical intimacy is also often something that's done in private,
but
not
that protects
always.
but certainly these other
the means of
the first
being
example,
at a concert and really
in many cases, is privacy.
getting lost.
Physical intimacy is also
Experience,
often something
being
that's done in
spontaneous,
private, but not in public,
always, and so on.
But certainly these
they don't
other
all
experiences
depend on
like
privacy.
being at a
But
concert
what they
and really
depend
just
on is the thing
getting
that privacy
lost
produces.
in the
Experience,
Oblivion,
being
this
spontaneous,
barrier against
and the
public
creation
and so on.
of
They don't
information.
all depend on privacy, but what
You
they depend on
use
is the thing that
two
privacy
concepts
produces.
in
Oblivion,
the book
this
to help
barrier against the
describe
creation
the
of
experience of privacy, so to speak. You don't use the word phenomenology, and many of our listeners won't know what it means, but I think it's adjacent to help that, the description of human experience. The experience you say that when someone privacy, is private, so speak, you don't use the word phenomenology, and many of our listeners won't know what it means, but I think it's adjacent to that, the presumably to human experience. And then you also describe them in a different section of the privacy as untethered to other people. They are unaccountable. We're getting close to the conversation, and then you also, but we still have some time, them in a different section of the book. What is it about untethered being other unaccountable and we're untethered close that to the conversation teaches us but we still have some time, the experience, the condition about of being private, unaccountable, and why are those that states of teaches us valuable? What's valuable about being unaccountable, and what's valuable about being private?
Yes,
and
I find the phenomenology
those
of privacy so
states
interesting,
of being,
but it's quite
valuable.
challenging.
What's valuable
I'm trying
about
to write
being
something on it, but it is
unaccountable, and what's
challenging, and to
valuable
get
about
at
being
why
untethered?
it's challenging, and I don't think this is just a
I find the
limitation
phenomenology
of
privacy
my ability
so
to
interesting,
think about these
and-
things, but
but
maybe
it's quite
something
challenging.
constitutive. I'm
About
trying to
privacy.
write something on it.
You could
but
take
it
your
is
suggestion and
challenging,
think
and to
about
get at
the
why
experience
it's challenging,
of
and I
these
don't think
other
this is just a
forms,
limitation
tethered and so
of
on,
my ability.
these other
to think about
forms
these
of
things, but
being
maybe it's
concealed. So
something
I could be
constitutive about privacy
in my office.
You could take your suggestion
and
think about
I can
the
be
experience
described as
of these
hiding
other
or
forms,
in private,
tethered, and
or
so
same
on.
as in my
These
home,
other
whatever.
forms of
And
being concealed.
I'm
So I could be
same person
in my
is
office,
concealed
in either place,
and
what
I can be
we would be
described
right to
as
describe me
hiding
as being in
or
hiding
private.
or
If
same as in my
I'm
home, or whatever.
doing the activity of
And
hiding,
I'm
there could be
same
somebody after me,
person
and so
is
I'm trying to
concealed in either
not be
place.
found, or I could even
What
be delusional.
we would be right
There might
to
not be
describe
anybody
me
after
as
me,
being
or
in
they've gone
hiding
home, they got bored,
if
or whatever, and I'm still
doing
hiding.
the
You could still say
activity
I'm
of
hiding.
hiding.
There
There could be
doing
somebody after me, and
something.
so I'm
And we
trying
know
to
we've all played
not be
hide and
found.
seek, and
Or I could even be
kids,
delusional.
we know
There
what
might
it
not be
feels
anybody
like.
after me, or they've gone home, they got bored, or whatever.
We're thinking
and I'm
about
still
being
hiding.
found
You could still say
all
I'm
the
hiding,
time. Thinking
because I'm
about
doing
the seeker,
something.
even if the
And
seeker
we
is
know we've all played hide and seek,
and we know
as
what it's
kids,
like to
we
keep a
know what
secret.
it feels like. We
Cling to it.
we might not
We're
always be thinking about it,
being
but when it comes
found
to our
all the time.
mind,
Thinking
it is
about
there.
the
We
secret,
know
even if
what
the
it
secret's
is,
gone.
and we're
Home.
concerned,
And we know
about
what it's like to
keeping
keep a secret
from others. So we
cling
know
to it,
what
it
we might
feels
not
like.
always be thinking about it,
Yet
but
hiding,
comes
we
to our
know
mind,
what it feels
is
like
there.
to keep
We
a secret.
know
That's
what it
easy to
is.
say.
And if you
we're
ask somebody,
concerned
okay, about
what does it feel like
from
to have
others,
privacy?
so we know
What does it feel
what
like to
feels
be in
like
privacy?
in private.
Yet hiding, we know
It's much
what it
harder to
feels like
answer.
keep a secret. That's
The
easy to
answer,
say.
I
And
ask
if you
this
ask
question
somebody, okay,
sometimes, and the
what does it
answer
feel like
I most
to have
often
privacy?
get is,
What does it feel like?
I don't
to be
know,
in privacy?
like
in private.
feels like nothing at all.
It's much
Or
harder
it
to
doesn't feel like
answer.
anything.
The answer.
That's
I
I
ask
think
this
that's
question
the
sometimes.
point. That's what
And
part
the
of why it's
answer
hard
I
to
most often
describe
get
is the experience
I don't
of
know,
privacy
like,
is this
feels like
kind
nothing at all.
of negative.
Or it doesn't
on the
feel like
one hand.
anything.
So it
And
feels
that's
like
I think that's
not
the point.
Not just
That's
not
what
being
part of why it's
surveilled,
hard to
not
describe
thinking that you're
is the
surveilled. And what does
experience
that
of privacy
feel like from the
is this
inside?
kind
Think about
of
what
negative
it's like
on the
to
one hand.
do
So
your
it
morning routine
feels
and take a shower
like
and be in your
not-
office or whatever.
Not just not
if
being
you
surveilled,
know you're
not
being listened
thinking
to,
that you're
you know you're being
surveilled. What is
surveilled.
that?
What are you
Feel
doing?
like
You're
from the
thinking
inside?
about. Think about what it's like
what
to
is each of
do your morning
these
routine,
actions?
take a shower, and be in
What
your
are-
office
how
or
are my
whatever.
words going to be interpreted?
If you
by
know
surveilling
you're being listened
authority,
to,
whoever
you're being
else could hear
surveilled.
them.
What are you doing?
You
You're
are
thinking about accounting
what does
for your actions
what
in
is
real
each
time.
of
You have
these
a kind of
actions mean?
self-conscious.
How are my words
that,
going to be
you know,
interpreted by the
that is
surveilling
directed toward
authority, whoever else could
whoever
hear
might
them?
be listening
You
or
are
wherever the information
accounting for your actions
eventually
in real
get
time,
articulating or narrating your life to yourself,
that,
thinking about
that is
directed toward. By contrast,
whoever
now
might
think
be
about,
listening
and
or
your
wherever
listeners
the
can do this
information
tonight when
eventually
they're
get
in the shower
articulating
or
or
reading
your life
the newspaper or
yourself
something,
and
and listening
thinking
to
about
this in the privacy of their
By
home.
contrast, now think about,
Take a
and
minute.
your
to
listeners
think,
can do this.
What is this
tonight when they're
experience
in the
like? 'Cause it is like something.
or reading
If it's an
newspaper
absence,
or
if it's the
something,
absence
listening
of
to this,
self-consciousness and
of
self-awareness,
their home,
accounting
that absence does feel like something. What is this experience like? Because it is like something on our lives. If it's an absence, if it's I think it is a kind of consciousness and freedom and openness that we get from not having to. It does have an effect, which we're going to naturally do if we, even if we're not being. I think it is a kind of think that there's a freedom and openness that we get, even if we're thinking about the podcast we're going to do later in the day, which we're going to naturally reciting maybe some of our not being answers or whatever, thinking about the public. Reasonable chance. We're accounting for ourselves a way that we're not thinking about really having the podcast we're going to do later in the day, and we're reciting maybe some of our answers or whatever, like thinking about the public. We're accounting for ourselves a way that we're not
to knowingly really have an audience and not have that audience like be part of the definition of who you are. To knowingly when I'm a performer audience, I am both the actor, the thing performing, but I'm also definition of performing for when I'm someone a performer, for a group of people. And the word performer necessitates the thing performing a externalizing of part of my identity that I'm necessarily connected, necessarily maybe tethered in your words to this audience, because I can't define myself as a performer without recognizing the presence of other people necessarily that I tethered in your words to this audience, because I shower or if I'm in the office by myself as a performer, and not only is there no audience, but I don't even think about the audience, then I'm untethered, I'm unaccountable, I'm fully free. In the office so it sounds like part of what you're saying is not only is there no audience, but I don't even think about the audience. Then I'm untethered, I'm unaccountable, you can I'm fully define free. Yourself so it sounds on like your own terms saying is that for yourself is without a reference necessarily under which to anyone else define yourself, because on your own terms the moment you do for that yourself you're without social or concern with other people anyone or else defined externally, because in a way that you do that. But at the same time, when you're at that state of privacy, concerned with the best thing to destroy that state is to think about it. And so you just have to be in that state of flow. You just have to be there. But at the same time, am I imposing an idea on you that is inaccurate? The best thing to destroy that state is to think about privacy is valuable in that state of flow.
The particular kind of epistemic barrier of privacy as opposed to secrecy and so on is good. Think that's one reason. You can go even farther privacy and say that valuable. You know, it's of course maybe it's good for self-discovery or being with yourself in a sort of Irving Goffman backstage way. I think you can go even farther. It's also and say that, and this is going to be of course maybe it's good for self-discovery or being with yourself, the audience. Irving Goffman for not being anything at all. But this goes back to the difficulty in articulating. This is going to be opposed to the idea of phenomenology or the experience of privacy. The idea of the audience is that for not being anything it's hard at all. Be. This goes back to the difficulty in articulating. We need to have an audience. We need to have a social phenomenology or the experience of privacy. Anyone at all. And if we want to maintain ourselves as it's hard to be over time with a similar sort of character. One person, we need to have an audience. We need to have a social life. I think we want to be performers. Anyone at all. We all are. And if we want to maintain ourselves as the world over time with a similar, that takes a lot of effort. And that takes a lot of well-being. Also, we are. I think would involve the opportunity to take off the mask and not just take off the mask. That's just not. That takes a lot of effort. Performing oneself. That is to say, well-being not to be anything at all. I think so would involve more than just being able to be myself at home. Take off. I think what the and not just take phenomenological or psychological benefit performing oneself of privacy, but also other forms of oblivion, like the one more than just being losing oneself at concert or whatever. I think what they give us is a period of psychological benefit, hard work of privacy, but also other forms of oblivion, like the one. Another sort of losing oneself, and that it's going to involve not just being with ourselves, as they give us, is a coming apart of repose from not being anything definite, being at least for a little while, person, rather than another.
You've anticipated what will probably be my final question.
With ourselves as ourselves,
in
but
that
coming apart.
One of the shifts you make in the book, and what you're talking about now, is. You've anticipated what will probably be my final question. So often privacy is discussed in terms of harm, in terms of what it takes away, in terms of protecting things. But there's an argument to be made for privacy in terms of human privacy is discussed in what it allows you to be, in terms of what it takes away, in terms of protecting things for us. But there's an argument to be made for privacy and human flourishing, because what I gather from your discussion is there's very little talk about privacy in this respect in the history of philosophy, that privacy is not associated with flourishing in the way that, let's say, there's very little talk about privacy, beauty or intellect, the core virtues of philosophy. What is it that privacy gives us associated with flourishing positively? In the way what is it that, let's say, privacy encourages, cultivates beauty or intellect that is necessary to be? What is it that a flourishing gives us?
I agree with you totally that we've overlooked the positive goods of privacy, in part because of the sort of frame we've had for thinking about it that we've brought out. I agree with you totally that we've adversarial or protective nature. The positive goods of privacy, in part because personal goods, the sort of frame we've had. And so the personal goods are sort of the ones we've just talked about. They're the ones that you get from experiencing protective nature state of privacy. From being personal goods and having the pressure, and so the personal goods are sort of the ones we just be one thing. They're the ones rather than get another. From this is a useful form of repose for people, and in being sort of technical ways, I talk about other goods that exist of others in the book. Be one thing. I want to take a more challenging another, and for me also form of exciting for people, and in like privacy, sort of that builds on something you said earlier too about how different types. I want to take a more challenging epistemic barrier. For me also knowledge reveal different things. Because I think that the privacy of others, something you said gives us good things about how different. So one is, the liveliness and barrier or limitation of your relationship you mentioned with your spouse or with our friends. The privacy of others, I think, gives us good things. If we either treat the things that we don't know about others, your relationship secrets with your spouse, or if we were to think that we knew everything there is to know about them, or at least we either treat the things that we don't know which could be known. Others, I think then we're going to find secrets that are our view of our friends to spouses, ourselves, everything there is to know about them, or at least and therefore they were the our relationship thing which could be too. I think another one is trust. That our view of our friends, the wife example, spouses, ourselves, bring secrecy back in. There's this whole the old cliche that there are no secrets in a relationship. And what that means is, if you're going to tell something to my wife, I'm probably going to hear about it. And everybody brings secrecy back in. There's this the old cliche that there are no secrets in a marriage. And maybe there's secrets, maybe what that means is just, if you're going to tell morning something to my wife, I'm probably going to hear about it. Wife is just structured by privacy, even if it's from the moment we wake up to the moment we go. Maybe there's secrets, maybe they're not, but there's just thinking, from morning to night, she's texting on her phone with my. And so we can imagine, what if I, instead of treating those from the moment we those limits to what I know about her, we go to sleep as private. What if I treated them as a moment when she's texting on the phone? Our relationship would just fall apart. It's kind of trustful, unknowing that sustains life together among two people would turn into the kind of impatient. Our relationship we associate with surveillance. This kind of trustful, unknowing. It's not hard to imagine how life together among day-to-day relations would turn into the less loving, less accepting. I think that scales up to a social level, or letting others disappear. It's not hard to imagine how where we know nothing, day-to-day relations, importantly, would become less loving, less accepting. We don't suspect that scales up to a social level. Letting others disappear sort of into a realm where we know unknowing of privacy. Importantly, think about it gives them the experience of being trusted. We don't suspect they're not treating my concealment there. We just give them office or whatever. Sort of what I do on my laptop that I'm like hiding something. Privacy. Trust me. It gives them the experience of being trusted by treating my and it also gives us the experience. Go into my office or whatever. Society is large. I do on my laptop. The experience like hiding something, trusting them. Trust me. Letting others my life in the right way, where we don't know privacy. And it also gives us the experience. So society is large. I think that's a good experience for trusting them. Forming our letting others go off. To have that experience. Let doing and we don't suspect to trust one's children. I think that's a good experience for us, but also one's fellow citizens, and so on. To have that experience.
This is actually a really wonderful place to end the conversation, because part of what you're pointing out is also my questions and the direction that I moved the conversation. This is actually a really wonderful place, fairly narcissistic or solipsistic, right? My privacy and how is my privacy violated? My questions and where are my boundaries? But part of what you're pointing out is that other people's fairly narcissistic or solipsistic, right? My privacy and how is my privacy violated? Everyone is concerned with themselves in some way. way, my boundaries, but part of what you're pointing just out think is that about other privacy in terms of our own needs is good for us. We have to think about privacy in terms of other people's needs too, and other people's respect and other people's flourishing, and that the social aspects and the social gifts of privacy can expand our empathy and can expand our world and can expand our respect and who we regard as important and personal gifts. And so I think that's a really, really nice way to end, just to remind ourselves that we're not in the center of the universe, that there are other people around too. Lowry, this is such an interesting conversation, and there's a lot more obviously in just to remind ourselves talk about we're not in the center of the universe, that there are other people around too. It's really important, Lowry, this is such an interesting conversation, and there's a lot more obviously in the book. We didn't from talk about privacy it's a very rich as a form of secreting information and controlling information to privacy as an element of human flourishing from opens up my understanding of it as a form of secreting to the information and tradition to privacy in a whole bunch as of really of human flourishing, compelling and powerful opens ways. Up my understanding of it. Lowry Pressly, thank you so much for joining us on Why philosophical tradition.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been just a real incredible,
compelling and
honor
powerful
to be on
ways.
this
So. You have been listening to Lowry Pressly and Jack Russell Weinstein on Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'll be back with a few more thoughts right after this.
Honor to be on this.
You have been listening to Lowry Pressly and Jack Russell Weinstein on Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life.
Visit IPPL's blog, PQED, Philosophical Questions Every Day, for more philosophical discussions of everyday life. Comment on the entries and share your points of view with an ever-growing community of professional and amateur philosophers every day. You can access the blog and view more information on our schedule, comment on the entries, and the Y Radio store at www.philosophyandpubliclife.org. You can access the blog and view more information on our schedule, our broadcasts, and the Y Radio store at www.philosophyandpubliclife.org.
You're back with Why Philosophical Discussions About Everyday Life. I'm your host, Jack Russell Weinstein. We're talking with Lowry Pressly about what privacy might mean in a very different way of thinking about everyday life. I'm your host, Jack in terms of secrecy and barriers to information and hiding stuff, privacy might rather thinking about it in terms of its role in fully realizing the human experience. Secrecy and what we get to information positively and hiding stuff. Rather thinking about it in terms of its private, role and he in fully realizing the human experience. And as I did in the monologue, one positively about in the United States being in private, and he mentioned against the law you can't compel a as I did in the monologue to testify against someone in the prosecution in court. There's this thing called spousal privilege. Against the law, you can't compel a spouse to folks who wrote testify the law originally against someone in the prosecution preserving the marriage and the intimacy of the marriage. And this is because more important than the public good of revealing the secrets. Folks who wrote the law originally, because the privacy of the relationship, the intimacy of the allows was the more important than the public good of who they need to be. Why? In order to keep the marriage privacy going. They can have fights. They can have secrets. They can have fantasies. They can have goals and who they can need to be. You know, strategize against people. That they can have fights. They can have secrets. Was public. It have fantasies. They can have goals and that can. We get the most out of it against if it's protected by this privacy. Marriage also, as Lowry points out, it couldn't be a real marriage. It also is a gift that to the other spouse out of it to let them be fully who they are. That we want our partner to flourish. We want our partner to be happy. We want our partner to be the most that they can be, to let them just as they want it from us. That we want privacy gives us to flourish. We want our partner privacy is to be happy. We want our partner to be the most that they can be. Without it, just as they want all of these human experiences that are privacy not available to us because we're always concerned with consequences, other people, judgments, without it, values, human experiences, making mistakes, what have you. Available to us. Privacy is always component of freedom. With. And this consequences, is a very new, judgment, very rich way values of thinking making about mistakes, a very what have you. Problem. Privacy is not, and this just a political or a social question. Very rich way. Privacy is an existential question, and it is a component of identity formulation. It is how we become who we are. And once you accept that existential question, there is a universe of new ideas to explore. It is how we really become who we are. Articulate and once you accept that of the human experience. There is a with all of that said, if you've been listening to this episode on Sunday evening on Prairie Public, please know that a longer version with almost 30 more minutes of discussion is available online and as a podcast. Visit yradioshow.org if you've been listening to this episode on Sunday evening on Prairie Public. For everyone else, rate us on iTunes and Spotify to help spread the word about the show. Follow us on all the usual social networks. Our handle is always at yradioshow. Subscribe for free. That's WHY For everyone else, rate us on iTunes and help us continue broadcasting by making your tax-deductible donation at yradioshow.org. Click donate in the upper right-hand corner to go to UND Alumni's donation portal. Leaves us solely on the money you provide. Thank you again to Lowry Pressly, the folks at Prairie Public, especially our engineer, click donate Callaway. I'm Jack Russell Weinstein signing off for Y Radio. Thanks for listening. As always, it's an honor. Thank you again to Lowry Pressly, the folks at Prairie Public, especially our engineer, Callaway. I'm Jack Russell Weinstein signing off for Y Radio.
Y is funded by the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life, Prairie Public Broadcasting, and the University of North Dakota's College of Arts and Sciences and Division of Research and Economic Development. Y is funded by the Institute for Philosophy and Public Life and can be found on his album Louis Soul. For more of his music, visit jazzfluteweinstein.com or myspace.com/Mark Weinstein. The music is written Philosophy is everywhere you make it, and we hope we've inspired you with our discussion today. For more of his music, remember, visit jazzfluteweinstein.com there is no ivory tower. /Mark Weinstein. Philosophy is everywhere you make it, and we hope we've inspired you with our discussion today. Remember, as we say at the Institute, there is no ivory tower.